So welcome to the Dixon's virtual talk at 2. I'm really glad you're here. And if you're not muted already, please take the time to mute yourself. And this talk is being recorded. So if you want to share it with someone else, or if you just have to see it again, you can go to the Dixon's YouTube channel and you'll be able to see it again. And you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have all kinds of talks and art activities and garden talks on there, so you will have all kinds of entertaining things. And during the talk, if a question pops into your head, then please go ahead and go down to the chat icon down at the bottom and type in your question before you forget it, so that Frans can answer your questions at the end of the talk. So Frans van Liere is a professor of medieval history at Calvin University, and his research specialty is the history of the medieval Bible and the 12th century school of Saint Victor in Paris. A native of the Netherlands, he has a PhD from the University of Groningen, and he published extensively on medieval biblical exegesis. I think I pronounced that right, I practiced it. 12th century intellectual history and 14th century papal history, and edited the biblical commentaries of Andrew of Saint Victor for the Corpus Christianorum series. He lives in Grand Rapids with his wife, who is also a professor at Calvin University. And they have 2 sons who are Eagle Scouts and soon to be engineers, and 2 cats, which we might meet during the talk, who knows. In his spare time, he sings, he plays flute, both modern and historic flutes, and trains for the occasional marathon. More power to you. So please let me welcome Frans van Liere.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here, and I checked out the website of the Dixon Gallery and Gardens, and I'm really sorry that I'm not able to stroll around in the gardens and see the gallery, but maybe in some future times, because it really looks like a delightful place. All right, I'm going to share my screen. For the PowerPoint. Everybody can see that all right? Good. All right, so I'm going to talk about the Bible in the medieval world, inspired by the St. John's Bible that is on display at the Dixon Gallery. But really, I want to start out with really the end of the Middle Ages, or beyond the end of the Middle Ages, with Martin Luther. And I want to acknowledge my student Adrian Ora, who drew my attention to this quotation. In his famous table talks in 1538, Luther recalls that, I quote, 30 years ago, no one read the Bible, and it was unknown to all. The prophets were not spoken of and were considered impossible to understand. And when I was 20 years old, they had never even seen a Bible. So Luther's assessment about the spread of the Bible and his own contribution to it by translating the Bible into German in 1523 has come to color people's perceptions of the state of biblical literacy in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, a period of about 500 to 1500. Many people, especially Protestants, are very eager to take Luther's statement face value. And they depict the medieval church as kind of a repressive institution in which priests limited access to the Bible for the laity in order to maintain their monopoly on religion. And the idea was, well, if people could read the Bible for themselves, they would no longer believe in the doctrines of the Catholic Church and all automatically become Protestants. Now, this is not only a problematic and a rather partisan interpretation of the history of the Reformation, but the interesting thing about it is that it's simply not borne out by the facts. Consider the following evidence. And I want to acknowledge another student of mine. Actually, she's a student of long ago. She's now a professor herself. And she works on a book known as the Ménager de Paris, and she drew my attention to his use of the Bible. So in and her name is Bobby Sutherland. In 1393, an anonymous author that today we know as the Ménager de Paris, or the Goodman of Paris. He's also known from a classic book, Medieval People, by Eileen Power. This Goodman of Paris wrote a book of advice for his young wife. He was middle-aged and she was only 15, so it was very likely that she was going to survive him once he died, and he wanted her to be prepared for her next marriage. The recipes for medieval dishes in this book have become famous. In fact, I've made a few of them myself and they taste really good. But the book contains much more than that. It gives advice on how to run a well-equipped bourgeois household, how to deal with the servants, how to impress your dinner guests. But it also contains a treatise on the 7 virtues and the mortal sins, and a list of examples of good and bad wives, all taken from the Bible. And to make his case, this Goodman of Paris cites the Bible at great length, and he cites it in French. So evidently, this upper middle class Parisian gentleman clearly had access to a Bible in French and used it to give his young wife instruction on how to be a good housewife. So that seems to contradict Luther's assessment that nobody read the Bible. Luther's quote has contributed to what people have called the Protestant paradigm of thinking about the medieval Bible. And the idea that Luther, for the first time, made the Bible available for a wider, non-clerical audience, that's this Protestant paradigm. People point to the newly invented printed press and say that that helped to spread the word that Luther, for the first time, translated. And all this worked together to bring about the Protestant Reformation. But is this sequence of events true? Now, there is strong evidence that especially the later Middle Ages were far from a Bible-starved period. Instead, we see a lively interest in Bible reading. We see a high rate of biblical literacy. Bibles, prayer books, devotional treatises, they're numerous in this period. So when Luther says that he had never even seen a Bible before he was 20, where were you all this time, Brother Martin? Evidence that contradicts this Protestant paradigm is abundant. But I think it's only in the last decades or so that it has started to transform our perception of how we think about the medieval Bible. So what was the role of the Bible in the medieval period? Let's go back to the beginning of the medieval period, to about the year 400. And in fact, at that time, we're still in the last days of the Roman Empire. So in the year 400, Christianity has been around for a few hundred years. But it was only a few decades earlier that it had become the officially accepted religion of the Roman Empire. There was probably the hope at that time that the church and Christianity would contribute to a greater sense of unity and stability in the Roman Empire, because cracks had started to appear in the seemingly invincible institution of Rome. The problem was only Christianity was not exactly a unity either. Christians could be found not just in the Roman Empire, but far and wide, even beyond the Mediterranean world, in Africa and Asia. I'm going to show you a variety of different Bible translations. Bibles could be found in Greek, in Coptic, in Gothic, in Aramaic, and of course in Latin as well. So even in the empire, in the Roman Empire itself, there were divisions among Christians. There were different creeds, and Christians didn't even speak all one language. Most Christians lived in the East, where Greek was spoken, while Latin was a language most people spoke in the western part of the empire. But even there was not really one translation of the Bible from Greek into Latin. There were many local and regional translations, because as Christianity spread, every church in the West had basically made its own translation, as they were presented with a need to hear it in Latin so that people could understand the Bible. Incidentally, the oldest translations of the Bible into Latin were made from the Greek because very few Christians read Hebrew. The Bible of the Christian church was the Greek Bible, and they were using a Greek translation that was actually already started by the Jews in the diaspora before the coming of Christ. This Bible was called the Septuagint. The problem was only that once Christians started using this Greek translation, Jews started to produce new Greek translations from the Hebrew, in a way saying, hey, the Christians have stolen our Bible. So as a result, there were even different Greek versions circulating as well. And then, of course, there were different Latin translations of these different Greek translations as well. So it was a mess. By the late 300s, the then Bishop of Rome, Pope Damasus, decided that this was the problem. The diversity of Bible texts would only create more division in the church within the empire. So he decided to ask a friend, Jerome, to create some unity in this bewildering diversity of Bible translations. And Jerome, depicted here in his study in a late medieval painting, you can see that Jerome also had a cat. So Jerome set to work, and after 2 decades of working in a very frustrated manner, he was ready to give up. Not only there were too many different Latin versions, no, there were different Greek versions. Which one was the true text? So by the early 400s, Jerome took a radical step of skipping the Greek altogether and basing himself on the Hebrew. That is, for the Old Testament. Of course, the New Testament was written in Greek, but actually Jerome never really got as far as working on the New Testament. He died before he could complete the entire Bible translation. So basing himself on the Hebrew was a radical step. It solved a lot of translation problems, but it created some theological issues instead. There were textual differences between the Greek and the Hebrew, but the Greek Bible also contained a number of books that could not be found in the Hebrew. And one famous theologian, a friend of Jerome, Augustine, well known for the book that he wrote, the Confessions, he thought that this was highly problematic. He said, now, East and West, the Eastern and Western part of the empire would not just have Bibles in different translations, but even use a different text and a different canon of the Bible as well. So, as with most new translations, Jerome's new translation was not exactly immediately popular. But Jerome's idea of going back to the Hebrew would actually come to have an enduring legacy, even if it was not immediately appreciated in his own time. But people later would say, well, if you really want to know what the Bible really says, you have to go back to the Hebrew. That idea was first brought up by Jerome. And the interesting thing is that Augustine's point of the division between Eastern and Western Christianity, a Latin Christianity and a Greek Christianity, was actually a moot point in the long run, because East and West, the Eastern West and Western part of the Roman Empire would only culturally grow wider apart, but then eventually politically split as well. And of course, eventually you would have two separate churches, one in the East and one in the West. Both Jerome and Augustine also lived through the sack of Rome in the year 410 by a Germanic tribe called the Visigoths. This sack of Rome was a sign of the times to come. And eventually, the Roman Empire in the western part would crumble and fall. Incidentally, these Visigoths that sacked the city of Rome, they had their own Christian creed, and they also had their own Bible in their own language. They may have been barbarians, but they certainly were not pagans, even though the Roman Church did consider them heretics. Anyway, less than a century after Jerome and Augustine lived, the western part of the Roman Empire had ceased to exist. The Roman Church was on the defense in that part of the former Roman Empire in Western Europe. It was on the defense against the new Germanic rulers. Some of them were heretics, and some of them were actually still pagans. For instance, the new rulers over the Roman province of Britannia, the Angles and the Saxons, they were still pagans. So in the year 596, another bishop of Rome named Gregory, he sent out a small group of missionaries to convert these pagans in distant lands. Actually, his own city was in a pretty bad state as well. It was war-torn and pestilence-ridden. But it didn't deter him from sending a small group of missionaries to faraway England. And with the help of Irish monks, this group of missionaries re-established the English church. Incidentally, in Ireland, Christianity had survived relatively unscathed, even though the Irish, their form of Christianity was a little bit weird. They celebrated Easter on a different date, for instance, and they were also organized around monasteries rather than bishoprics as the Roman Church. But they worked together, and eventually the English church became a center of Christian learning which was in decline everywhere after the fall of Rome. And this center of Christian learning is witnessed by some of the beautiful manuscripts that were produced this time in England. Like, for instance, the Book of Kells. You can see a fragment of that on the left. Actually, the Irish maintain that it was produced in Ireland, while the English say that it was done in England. So there's kind of an ongoing feud between the two. And the Book of Durrow that you can see on the right. They illustrate the flourishing Christianity in England in the early Middle Ages. The English church even became instrumental in Christianizing the Frankish kingdom, which was the kingdom that emerged on what is today France and parts of Germany. So interestingly, the oldest complete copy of the Latin translation of the Bible by Jerome that we have was actually made around the year 700 in Northumberland, in the north of England. It was copied of a Bible that the missionaries probably brought from Rome. And this copy, today it's in a library in Florence, and it's called the Codex Amiatinus. It was made as a presentation copy in the north of England. The idea was to send this one back to the Pope as to say, look, how we are doing. Look how well your mission has succeeded. This copy was made as a confirmation of a shared faith and a shared Bible. And note that this Bible, by this time, was Jerome's text, augmented with the older Latin versions of the apocryphal books. And the apocryphal books, that is the ones that were found in the Greek Bible, but not in the Hebrew Bible. So this is what eventually became the medieval Bible. And it was Jerome's Bible, at least for the greater part. Meanwhile, on the continent, here's another wonderful illustration from the Codex Amiatinus. Meanwhile, on the continent, things were looking up. The Frankish king Charlemagne embarked on a courageous attempt to evoke some of the former glory of the Roman Empire. He was crowned emperor by the Pope on Christmas Day in Rome in the year 800, seen here in a kind of a late medieval rendering of that scene. With the help of some of the monks from England, he tried to bring back learning and promote the Christian church and establish monasteries throughout his realm. His ideal of a Roman emperor was a little bit more like Constantine than Augustus, because it was meant to be a Christian Roman Empire, or a revival of the Roman Empire. The backbone of his empire stood a network of bishops, lords, and abbeys, all tied to the king or emperor in devotion to a common God and a common faith. And with that went, of course, a common Bible. Some monasteries, such as the one in Tours in France, could hardly keep up with the demand for new written Bible codices. It turned out dozens of these very impressive and beautifully, clearly and uniformly written Bibles. Here's one example of a Bible that was written in the monastery of Tours in France in the Frankish Empire that eventually ended up in the monastery of Montmoutier-Grandval. Today it's in London. And the first printers in the Renaissance were actually looking for a visually pleasing and clear classical letter type to produce their first printed text. They went back to this particular handwriting. It's called the Carolingian minuscule. It's kind of the forerunner of our Times Roman font. And they chose it because it was so beautiful and uniform and so classical looking, even though it's actually Carolingian. So you can see this revival in the Carolingian times, the revival that comes with an establishment of a unified Bible text throughout Europe. And it was Jerome's Bible text. And then this happened. These guys came along, the Vikings. This glorious resurgence all but came to an end in the great upheaval of the 9th century, the incursions of the Vikings. These Scandinavian marauders plundered and destroyed many monasteries and abbeys across Europe, carrying off its inhabitants as slaves and their Bibles as precious loot. Of course, I guess the Vikings didn't really care for the written text, but on the outside, these Bibles were beautifully decorated as well with silver and gold and precious stones. By the way, there was one interesting effect of this revival of learning in England and in Carolingian times in the early Middle Ages. And that was that much of their learning was based on a revival of learning in the Roman Empire. Even the Christian late Roman Empire. The language of that learning was, of course, Latin. So as a result, Latin in this period became the language of learning, the language of the church. Of course, people didn't speak or learn Latin at home. No, Europe's barbarians spoke a great many languages, a variety of Germanic languages in the north, to a variety of Latin-based vernacular Romance languages in the south. But what united them was this common language of worship and learning, this language, common language of the church, Latin. So for day-to-day use, they used their mother tongues, but Latin had to be learned. To be educated basically meant to be bilingual. You spoke your own language, your vernacular language at home, but Latin was a language for the official learned use, for sacred business. Vernacular was the language that people spoke from day to day. We call this situation not really bilinguality. We call this diglossia, from the Greek word glossa, language. So it means that there are two kinds of languages that are current in a particular region or land. They're known as the H language and the L language, respectively. H stands for high, the formal language of literature and education. L stands for low, the language commonly used for ordinary conversation. Today, now there is still somewhat of a distinction between the two, of the official English and the spoken English, even though I think the two boundaries are quickly disappearing. But in some countries like India, you still have a similar distinction, right? In India, English is used as the official language. It's the language of the government, but Hindustani and Urdu are spoken for everyday communication. So a similar situation was the case with Latin in medieval Europe. Needless to say, the Latin Bible was in this H language, while the language of the people was the L language. To a certain degree, this is still the case, right? We still have somewhat of a distinguish between a higher, more literate form of English and the more spoken English. And most people expect the Bible to be in this higher, more literate form of English than the spoken English, right? Most people, they love the King James Bible, and that's the Bible. And when they hear Eugene Peterson's The Message, they bristle and say, oh, that sounds too much like actual language that people speak. and it feels weird to hear the Bible in that language. So a similar situation was true in the medieval period, only there the Bible really is in a different language, a language that really had to be learned. So no wonder that most medieval Bibles were in Latin. But not all Bibles were in fact in Latin. The L language was often used for epic literature and for songs, and we see that in the early Middle Ages, the Bible was sometimes rendered into a variety of poetic paraphrases, into epic poems or song as well, and for that, people used the L language, the language that people actually spoke. Thus, we have Bible poetry in a variety of Old Franconic, Old Saxon, and Old English languages in this period. There was even an attempt, which is quite interesting. In the wake of the Viking incursions, there was an attempt to make Old English into the H language. In the time of King Alfred, the English kingdom was hanging on for dear life in the south of England, facing an onslaught of Viking incursions. But at the time, a serious attempt was made to create a vernacular learned language, presumably partly because Latin learning was hard to find. Now, from this time dates a remarkable Bible translation. In the 10th century, almost the entire Bible was translated into Old English. Much of it's the work by one monk from Eynsham near Oxford named Elfrich. Now, this Elfrich, in his Old English Bible, which you can see here in the image, he did have some hesitation to translate the Old Testament into the language that both clergy and laity could easily read. He said, he warned that listeners should attempt only to read these texts with the right kind of understanding. He didn't want the nobleman for whom he wrote to get any wrong ideas. So he says, look, when the book of Samuel starts out with a sentence that says, there was a man in the land of Ramathaim Sophim, and he had 2 wives, he says, Alfred says, don't get any wrong ideas, right? You are not allowed to have 2 wives. Clearly, you should take this in a spiritual way, in an allegorical way. And Alfred says, it's like God is the husband, and he has 2 wives. It's like 2 peoples, the people of the Jew and the peoples of the people of the Christians. First were fertile, but now they are barren. And the second people, they're the ones who trusted in God's promise of the one who will be born. So in the book of Samuel, that's Samuel, who is promised as a child there. And Alfred says allegorically that stands for the Jesus Christ, who is going to be born as Christ the Savior. So eventually, Hannah, the mother of Samuel, would have many children. And eventually, the church, Christianity, would have many followers as well. So allegorical exegesis in the Middle Ages often was tinged with somewhat of an anti-Jewish polemic. Anyway, so this is the Old English Bible. The Anglo-Norman conquest by William the Conqueror in 1066 actually ended this short-lived experiment in making English into an H language. It would have to wait until the 16th century. Ironically, William the Conqueror's ancestors had been Vikings. So, Christianity and culture actually did survive the Vikings. Eventually, these Vikings settled and became part of the culture that they had set out to plunder, like William the Conqueror. But it took a while before Europe would see a true cultural and economic revival, until the 11th and the 12th century. And this recovery was different from that of the Carolingian Empire in that it was not centered around large rural estates in the countryside, the estates of the nobility. This revival was centered in cities. The church played an important role in this recovery, especially schools that had started up at the cathedrals that were now being built as around the center of this urban revival. You know, the seat of the local bishop and the ecclesiastical center of the city life was the cathedral, and these cathedrals were now being built and beautified in great numbers. So some people even speak of this 11th and 12th century revival of culture as a renaissance. Mind you, not the Renaissance, that would come much later in the 16th century, but the 12th century Renaissance, because it also was inspired by a revival of the classics. One thing that this revival of the classics did in the 12th century was, of course, strengthen this diglossia that we talked about, the gap between the H and the L languages. In the medieval universities that started to flourish in these cities, Latin was used as the learned language. So what does that mean for the Bible? Well, first of all, the demand for Bibles was growing more than ever before. In the medieval universities, a new type of Bible was even developed, one that was easily portable. This new Bible was not a massive text that would be placed on a reading lectern in the middle of the monastery, in the church in the monastery, but a text that could be easily carried. A text that was, could be used by a student going into the university, or a preacher going from town to town, preaching the word of God. So these 13th century Bibles, and here you can see an example of that, they're astonishingly small, but they still contain the entire text, Apocrypha and all. This type of Bible, the book that you see here is probably about only 5 inches tall, right? The 13th century really invented the pocket Bible. And this type of Bible was commercially produced by professional scribes in medieval university towns. One consequence of this mass production, however, was that mistakes could easily be made in the copying process. Medieval scholars felt the need to produce a better, more accurate Bible text free of mistakes very urgently. And this, in turn, sparked a renewed interest in Jerome's original idea to study the Hebrew text to see what the text really should be. Centuries of copying had deteriorated the Latin Bible text, and recourse to the Hebrew, often with the help of local rabbis, local Jews, encouraged Christians to delve deeper into the philology of the Bible text. So you can see that kind of, professional Bible scholarship is growing in this period. The other thing that happens in this period is that we can see a growing literate lay middle class in this period, in these cities. Even though this middle class was to a certain extent bilingual, I think most people knew probably a smithereen of Latin. Most of the prayer books at the time, like the one pictured here, were in fact in Latin, and people probably said their fixed daily prayers in Latin as well. But they clearly preferred the vernacular over the Latin. This created a demand for Bible translations. And those vernacular translations soon started to appear. We have Bible translations in this period in French, in Dutch, in German, and so on. Now, there was for the church one problematic aspect of this sudden proliferation of vernacular translations, and that was that one thing that the increased urbanization and literacy did was increase the number who might dissent from the main church in Rome as well. Heretical groups often formed and encouraged by lay preachers who encouraged devotions around these vernacular Bible texts. And that was a concern, right? The Bible was a difficult book, difficult to understand, difficult to misinterpret, as we saw in the case of Alfred and his noble audience. So, it was easy to draw the wrong conclusions from it, at least conclusions that did not agree with the official teaching of the church. And this is why the church probably was somewhat ambivalent about this proliferation of vernacular translations. On the one hand, Bible reading and devotion was encouraged, but on the other hand, it was emphasized that these translations did not replace the Latin Bible text. But Latin was the only source from which authority could be derived. And only if it was read in accordance with the teaching of the church, then it was okay to read these translations. But despite occasional prohibitions against Bible reading, which really were prohibitions against reading the Bible in a way that did not accord with the teaching of the church, in general, Bible reading was encouraged. In fact, people in the later Middle Ages didn't need any encouragement because there was a lively lay interest in Bibles, Bible reading, devotions, prayers based on the Bible, both in the vernacular and in Latin. And here is an example of a prayer book in Dutch from this period. So rather than biblical illiteracy, biblical literacy was at an all-time high towards the end of the Middle Ages. And the huge numbers of Bibles and prayer books from this period is proving it. In fact, I think that, think of the late Middle Ages, the time of the pandemic, the first large pandemic in Western civilization, the Black Death. And I think that this pandemic, probably people became immensely concerned about their own death and their fate in the afterlife. And this meant that sort of interest in Bibles and prayer books and devotional literature reached fever pitch. Now, the interesting fact about it is that this kind of devotion did not exactly meet the approval of Luther, because this type of devotion was intensely centered around the belief in purgatory and concerned about doing works of penitence to get out of purgatory. And this fueled a desire for the assurance of forgiveness, which was given in the form of indulgences. And it is indulgences that really started Luther's protest movement. So Luther sharply rejected this type of devotion. So one other thing that's happening in this period, towards the end of the Middle Ages, we also see an increased growth of academic biblical studies. As I said, it started with a study of Hebrew in the 12th century. But in the 15th century, this was expanded with an increased knowledge of Greek. And that was inspired by the Renaissance. This interest in classical studies is exemplified by Erasmus of Rotterdam, who in 1516 established a new critical text of the New Testament in Greek. And he provided it with a new and updated translation into Latin for the first time since Jerome. But the interesting thing is that what really would hit the market pretty soon is the fact that this was the text that Luther used to newly translate the New Testament, not from Latin into German, but directly from Greek into German. Of course, I should mention also that there is one technological breakthrough that changed the way that the Bible was conceived and produced in this period of the late Middle Ages. And that was, in fact, Gutenberg's printing press. Invented in 1455, so Luther wasn't even born yet. The printing press fits neatly into this picture of proliferation of Bibles and devotional literature. You have to keep in mind that the printing press, even though Gutenberg, who invented the printing press, he did print eventually a Latin Bible on it, but he didn't really invent the printing press for printing a Bible. What he made his money with, and he was a shrewd businessman, was printing indulgences and devotional pamphlets, right? That's where the money was. And if you could mechanize this process and churn out even more of it, more money he could make with it. It's basically the trend of professional production of Bible texts that's completed by Gutenberg's printing press invention. And soon, of course, people were using this to print Bibles in the vernacular as well, before Luther. Like, for instance, this Bible in German, printed by Anton Koberger in 1483. And this Bible in Dutch, printed in Delft in 1477. Right? All this is decades before Luther. Anyway, so to conclude, now there's little evidence of blanket prohibitions against Bible readings or suppression of Bible translations during the Middle Ages. Quite the contrary. The flourishing culture of biblical literacy and Bible translation might actually have prepared the way for Luther's radical new theology. So the Protestant paradigm isn't exactly correct. The popular idea is, well, we have Luther's new translation, and then we have Gutenberg to spread the word by the printing press, and that all leads to the Reformation. I think that needs to be revised. But instead, it's the other way around, right? You see a flourishing biblical literacy, helped along by the printing press, for sure. All this set the stage for, and it's not caused by Luther's Reformation. And of course, Luther's Reformation did include a new Bible translation into German, but it was by no means the first. Well, if you are a little bit worried that I'm diminishing the importance of Luther here, sorry for Lutherans, but don't worry. I do think that Luther's message was new and revolutionary. And what I want to suggest here is that it didn't really have to do with a question of whether people read the Bible. It had more to do with a question of how people read the Bible. Luther did introduce a radical new theology, emphasizing God's grace, unmediated by a priestly hierarchy. He did away with the whole idea of purgatory, indulgences, and penitence, and all of that was diametrically opposed to the theology of the Catholic Church. What was also a first is that Luther's translation into German was the first vernacular translation not based on the Latin, but based on the Greek and the Hebrew. But this, I think, was not a new idea, right? In fact, he was basing himself on Erasmus, who had come before him, who already had studied Greek. And in fact, the study of Hebrew had started with Jerome about 1,000 years earlier. And this idea of going back to the Hebrew and the Greek text, that was an idea that was cultivated and practiced in the medieval schools. So there, I think, Luther was an heir to, rather than a rebel against, medieval tradition. So an interesting side effect is that, of course, Latin gradually would lose importance as a language of worship and learning. Starting with Luther's translation, vernacular translations were no longer seen as derivative of the Latin, and no longer was Latin the only authoritative text, but the German translation now was on equal foot with the Latin, because both were based on the Hebrew and the Greek. So in the long run, Luther's translation meant that the L language had won the game, replacing Latin as the H language. All right, I hope that this will give you somewhat of a reappreciation of the medieval heritage of the Bible and spark interest in this multifaceted and fascinating period in the development of the Bible. If you want to read more, maybe you can put in a soundbite for my own book called Introduction to the Medieval Bible, which you can get from Cambridge University Press. And here are some of the copyright illustrations, acknowledgements as well. But I will stop sharing this and see if there are any questions that you have that I might want to answer.
There are some questions. There's some really good ones. So Randy wants to know, did different regions of Europe stick to a specific tradition, or was it a free-for-all?
What period are we talking about?
I specifically have 2 or 3 of the folio facsimiles of Duke John of Berry, his Book of Hours. So beautiful. Early 15th century. Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing is that very often what we see in these vernacular translations, France seems to have been an important center of that, with a Bible translation which is known as the Bible historiale, or the History Bible. And the interesting thing, I don't know if you remember the quote of Luther at the beginning. He did have a point that this History Bible was actually cutting out the prophets. So, the prophets were kind of considered too difficult for use by the laity. So these translations were mainly interested in translating the historical books and the story. It was a story Bible more than a Bible that contained, more difficult theological stuff like the Book of Job or the prophetical books. And this French vernacular translation, this History Bible, became a model for for Dutch, German, Scandinavian translations as well. So this model of the History Bible, that became very widely spread as the vernacular Bible translation.
Well, there's Rennie has another question that's good. Were the translations based on the results of the Council of Nicaea or modifications of the translations later?
The earliest Latin translations, most of those were kind of independent of the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea was really dealing with theological issues, question of the Trinity and the natures of Christ. By that time, we can see that there are already different Bible translations. There are different Greek versions, even though the Septuagint is the main Bible in Greek at the time. But there are different Latin translations. Of course, people outside the Roman Empire, they had their own translations. The Aramaic Bible, the Gothic Bible, most of those are based on the Greek. So there was a huge diversity of Bible translations already at the time of the Council of Nicaea. All of these came with different, at the same time of the Council of Nicaea, people are also concerned about creating some consensus about the contents of the Bible as well. Now, which means that there was, for let's say 80%, people were agreeing about the contents of the Bible, but there were a couple of books where there were still some questions, and that was about the apocryphal books. Were the apocryphal books part of the Bible or not? Weird books like Baruch, is that part of the Bible or not? There were a couple of letters of Paul circulating where some people say, yeah, that's really from by Paul, and other people say, no, it's probably one of his students that was writing it. So we see at the same time as the Council of Nicaea, the first canon lists of books, what belongs in the Bible and what does not. And there is largely a consensus formed around that. But, maybe the consensus now was about 90% of the Bible. Even during the Middle Ages, there were still a couple of Bible books where people were wondering, well, is this part of the Bible? Is this not part of the Bible? Right? The fourth book of Ezra, for instance. And there were a couple of additions to the book of Daniel, additions to the book of Chronicles, where sometimes you find them in medieval Bibles and sometimes you don't. So it was not really in the time of the Reformation that actually the Council of Trent, the big reaction of the Catholic Church to Luther wanted to go back to the Hebrew Bible. So he said all this apocryphal books, they have no authority whatsoever. But the apocryphal books were widely read or were part of the medieval Bible, and Luther wanted to do away with them or diminish their authority. So it's the Council of Trent that said, no, these are really part of the Bible. And they call them the deuterocanonical books, sort of second rank canonical books. And then, of course, you have different Protestant confessions that also try to come up with their Bible list and say, no, here's the books that really belong in the Bible. So it's not really until the time of the Reformation that this canon is really fixed into fixed lists.
How did the Book of Hours differ from the copies of the Bible from the same time frames?
Well, books of hours are not really Bibles. Books of hours, monks were always, in the Rule of Benedict, monks are required to say prayers 8 times a day, even in the middle of night. And most of what they were doing was Bible reading and going through the book of Psalms. So the Book of Hours is really kind of an imitation of the monastic habit of saying Psalms at fixed hours of the day, including Bible readings, but mainly including Psalms. These psalms were organized according to, well, the Book of Hours really started as a devotion to the Virgin Mary. It was called the Little Office of the Virgin Mary. That was the basis of the Book of Hours. And it was kind of the attempt to experience thinking about the Passion or thinking about the Nativity through the perspective of Mary. And many of these psalms were read, as psalms that Mary could have prayed at the time of the Nativity or during the time of the Passion as well. So the Book of Hours really started as a kind of a Marian devotion, and mainly consisted of fixed prayers during the daytime, but it was a selection from the Psalms and a selection of some of the canticles that we find in different parts of the Bible as well, accompanied by selected Bible readings. The organization principle is really more liturgical rather than in the biblical order.
So just to clarify on that, or actually kind of go a little bit farther into it, I know you mentioned that toward the Middle Ages, they went back to the Hebrews, they went to the rabbis and stuff and asked them specifically about the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. Sure, because the translations and, the copying had changed it so much. Did any of that impact the Book of Hours or the Bible significantly, specifically the Book of Hours? Because that's kind of what I fell into when I started collecting this stuff.
Maybe not that significantly for the Book of Hours, because the Psalms, the Book of Psalms was kind of a problematic book because there were two different translations circulating in the Middle Ages of the Book of Psalms. And Jerome had made two translations. One was kind of a revision of the older translation from the Greek, and the other one, and then he said, that's not really good. So he had made a new translation from the Hebrew. But, as you know, or probably, if you want to start a rebellion in the church is when you try to change the way that they sing, right? And so when Jerome came with his new translation of the Psalms, nobody wanted to accept that. So people stuck to the old translation of the Psalms. And generally, Jerome's translation was seen more as a learned. If you really wanted to delve deep into the meaning of the Psalms, that's when you used Jerome's translation, and that's when you studied the Hebrew alongside with it. But for the liturgical use, generally the older Latin translations kept being used.
We've got one more question. It's a question I had. I know the St. John's Bible is. They very, very purposely made it on vellum because they wanted it to last as long as the medieval Bibles have. And I noticed that the pocket Bibles that you showed, they looked like they were printed on paper. So when did they make that switch from vellum to paper?
No, they're not paper. They are extremely thin vellum. I don't know how they got the vellum that thin. There's different theories. Some people say, they scraped it really, really well. Some people say, no, it's vellum that was made from smaller animals, like even rabbits or, cats. I don't think that vellum was actually made of cats. I don't see that happening in the Middle Ages. I think they just scraped it really, really, really thin. And generally, I think it was probably made of calf skin or maybe even pig skin. So yeah, they just had extremely thin vellum, and you can't even imagine how thin they got it. And it's a tiny, I can't even read it without a magnifying glass. So let alone that people were writing this stuff without a magnifying glass. Paper is quite interesting. Paper became common later. So it starts in the 13th century, but paper was seen as an inferior material. Paper was seen as something that was good for your accounts and for doing calculations for your business accounts. It was not seen as something that was dignified enough to carry the word of God. Partly, paper was made of rags, so there was kind of, you don't want the word of God written on something that's made of old underwear, so to say, right? it was seen as and partly also people had qualms about paper because it was an invention that came into Europe through the Muslim world. And in the 12th century, we have some people who say, yeah, vellum, that was made for the word of God. Whereas paper, yeah, that's a Muslim material, and you don't want God's words to be written on a material that was invented by infidels. So people had kind of a reservation about the use of paper. But of course, I think eventually paper is much cheaper. It's much easier to print on paper with the printing press than on vellum. It smudges much less. So I think eventually the practical won out over the principle, if you can call it principle. I think basically material is material, right? It's the content that counts. But eventually, I think the commercial value won out the fact that paper was simply easier to produce and a cheaper material, and especially when the material is getting so out of hand, as it were, in the time of Gutenberg, people had to start and switch over to paper.
Well, thank you. That was very interesting. Full of information. Wow. I'm very impressed. Thank you very much. Great questions. And if anybody has any last questions, you can unmute and you can ask it, or you can just say thank you and Happy New Year.
I'm also quite happy if you have my my email, and I'll put it in the chat. Then I'm very happy to answer further questions if you might have some. Okay, there's my email. So if you have further questions, I'd be very happy to entertain some of those further questions. It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Diane's unmuted. Diane, did you want to say anything? Lynn?
Thank you. We enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Okay, well, I'm about to end the meeting. So if anybody wants to say something, say it really quick.
Thanks. Say hi to your cat.
Yes. All right. Bye. Thank you so much. It was great.